Lately, there's been a lot of discussion about how Western militaries should prepare for a war against Russia and what types of equipment they should invest in now that the defense budgets are increasing. Should the money be spent on traditional platforms such as tanks and fighter jets and large warships, or should the focus instead be on new technologies such as the drones and unmanned systems that have proven their worth in the war in Ukraine? What I want to do in this video is to offer a few points that I think are important to keep in mind when we make these decisions, because if Western militaries have the wrong focus and they purchase the wrong equipment, then the consequences can be catastrophic if there is an actual war with Russia. So let's talk about it. With growing defense budgets in many countries, that naturally raises the question of how that money should be spent. And the answer is not obvious, because while the threat is growing and countries see the need for increased defense spending, it's also clear that there is a revolution in military affairs that's happening, and it's driven by the technological developments that we can see in the war in Ukraine. So that raises questions about whether the old types of equipment that we would otherwise traditionally have invested in are still relevant, or if they've become obsolete, if they have been replaced by unmanned platforms and artificial intelligence. And I obviously can't give precise answers on how the money should be spent in each country, but what I want to do in this video is to offer a few points that I think are important to keep in mind when we have the discussions. And the first point is that it's important not to underestimate the consequences of the drone revolution. The unmanned technology is a revolution, and it's a revolution on the scale of the invention of the airplane or the invention of the tank. And we don't want to be those guys who kept advocating for horse-mounted infantry 20 years after the invention of the tank. We want to be the ones who have the foresight to see what's happening and what's going to be needed in the future. And drones are an invention on that scale. There's going to be a clear distinction between the time before and after the mass emergence of drones on the battlefield. And it will require militaries to adopt this new technology, but it will also require that all doctrines need to be adjusted accordingly. Soldiers will need to learn how to fight alongside the drones, and there will still be a place for soldiers on the front line. Manned platforms are not going to disappear, but the roles will change. Fundamentally, drones have done two very important things on the front line. The first is that they've made the battlefield transparent, which means that the element of surprise that used to be an advantage that the attacker had has largely been neutralized by the defender's ability to monitor everything in real time. And secondly, drones have brought down the price of firepower to a level where the overall amount of firepower that can be fielded in a war is just much larger than what it used to be. And that means that in the age-old debate about attritional warfare versus maneuver warfare, the pendulum is currently swinging towards attritional warfare. And that's going to challenge many Western militaries, because what pretty much all Western officers have learned in military academies is that maneuver warfare is superior to attritional warfare. But with the emergence of unmanned technology, that is no longer the case. And it's going to be difficult to adjust for many soldiers and officers to this new reality. But the way I think we need to understand this going forward is that there will be a division of labor between manned and unmanned platforms. We will need to use unmanned technology for the attritional part of the battle, and then once the enemy's capabilities have been degraded, that can open the path for maneuver warfare. Because we will still need maneuver warfare. We will still need the ability to conduct offensive operations, but that maneuver warfare can then be conducted with unmanned platforms and with manned platforms. But if we introduce the manned platforms into the battle before the enemy has been sufficiently degraded, then that will lead to disaster. And that leads to the second point I want to make, which is that future warfare is to a large degree going to be about attrition. This is simply a result of these systems becoming more affordable. Firepower is cheaper today than it used to be, and therefore countries are going to have more firepower. And that means that when we make procurement decisions, then we need to consider attrition. We need to expect that the equipment that we buy is going to be destroyed in the war. And that has consequences for which types of equipment it makes sense to buy. In the past 25 to 30 years, Western militaries have largely transformed into organizations designed for expeditionary operations and counterinsurgency warfare. And that's a kind of military reality where we expected to suffer very few casualties. If we bought, say, 100 infantry fighting vehicles, we would expect to lose only very few of them. So it made sense to buy the best of the best. we could afford to go for the most expensive infantry fighting vehicle if it had some advantages over the second best, because the priority was to equip the units that were deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq with the best possible equipment. And then it mattered less what kind of equipment the units at home would be using, and it was also not a priority to have large reserves of these infantry fighting vehicles in garages ready for mobilization. This procurement mentality has to change. Now we need to think about quantity in a different way. We need to have reserves so that we can mobilize for war, and we must expect that much of the equipment that we have when the war breaks out is going to be destroyed and will need to be replaced. And that is actually the third point. We need to be aware that the military we start the war with will not be the same military that wins the war. So although this might sound counterintuitive, we actually need to move beyond the tendency of thinking that we must build an army that is capable of defeating Russia in a war. What we need to build instead is a military that can ensure that we get a good start in a war with Russia. Some of the equipment that we have when the war begins might be the same that we have when it ends, but a lot of it will not. So we need to start thinking about how to gain the capability to scale the production of military equipment and to have the innovation processes that will enable us to stay technologically ahead of the enemy. In peacetime, we build the army that will fight when the war begins. And then during the war, as soon as it breaks out, we will start producing for the next army that will take over once the first one is used. So that's how you prepare for a war of attrition. And that's also why it's so important to embrace the revolution of unmanned technology, because it's much better if the first army that gets consumed mostly consists of unmanned technology. We would much rather have the Russians trading their soldiers for our robots than the other way around. The fourth point I want to highlight is the revolution in long-range fires. The pace at which Russia can produce drones and missiles is just overwhelming compared to Europe's ability to defend against these drones and missiles right now. And obviously, there's a lot of work going on, especially with Ukraine spearheading efforts to build effective and affordable missile defense systems. But there is a long way to go before all of Europe has anything that resembles any kind of meaningful protection. So that is the defensive capabilities. We need to prepare for that for the long-range fight. But also, just as importantly, Europe really needs to get its act together in terms of building an offensive capability so we can also strike back. Way too few European countries actually have the capability to strike deep into Russia. And those that do have way too small quantities of these long-range capabilities. And you're not going to win a war if all you can do is try to defend yourself against the enemy's missiles. You really need something that can strike back so you can take out the production facilities and you can defeat Russia's war economy. So it's important to understand that the revolution in military technology in terms of the drones and robots on the front line is accompanied by an equally important revolution in long-range missile technology. And then finally, just to complicate things fully, the last point I want to make is that I also think it's important that we understand that even though this new technology changes many things, it's not going to change everything. There will still be humans on the battlefield, and it's much better if these humans are transported in armored vehicles instead of in civilian cars. If the armored vehicle is hit, the vehicle might get damaged, but the soldiers have a chance of surviving, right? So we will still need armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles. We will also need tanks, and there will be tasks that only infantry can solve, which cannot be solved by a robot. Just simply things like having the ability to communicate with people in a war zone. That's something that you can really only do well in face-to-face human communication. This discussion is especially relevant when we look at the maritime domain because classical warships are extremely expensive, and at the same time, the war in the Black Sea has shown that they're also very vulnerable. So the question is whether it makes sense to spend billions on buying a new frigate when you could get just a ridiculous number of drones for the same price. And this is where it's important that we keep in mind that the new technology also has limitations, and there are many things that drones simply cannot do. Warfighting is not the only thing that militaries do, and if we look at European states broadly, they will face many challenges in the future that are not specifically high-intensity warfare, but they're more other types of responsibilities where they need to use military assets to solve a task. Or it will involve expeditionary operations where you need to deploy forces away from Europe to operate elsewhere in the world. And in those types of situations, you really need to bring something that is capable, that can make a difference in the operational area, and also can sustain itself over time. And that's why there will also be a need in the future for frigates and destroyers in European navies. For example, even though they are perhaps not the most suitable platforms to bring into the Baltic Sea if there is a war in the Baltic, they are pretty much the only thing that we have to deploy to situations like the Strait of Hormuz, or to counter piracy operations, or whatever else we need to do around the world. So it's going to be a challenge to find the right balance there between different types of equipment. On the one hand, we need to embrace the new technology. We need to understand that drone technology is revolutionizing warfare to an extent that requires us to reconsider pretty much everything. And we need to stay on top of this development, because otherwise we will risk taking just horrific casualties if we end up in a war with Russia. But then we also need to understand that drones, unmanned vehicles, new technology, it's not going to solve everything. There is still a need for many of the old capabilities, either because we still need them in a war with Russia, where they will still play a role on the battlefield and they will be working together with unmanned platforms in different ways, or because we need them for expeditionary operations or other types of missions around the world where we need our militaries to project power. We need to be able to send powerful capabilities that can operate independently and can sustain themselves for a long period of time far away from Europe. And that is just not a drone. So we will need to find the right balance. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful or informative, then please give it a like, and remember to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I publish new videos. If you want access to bonus videos and to support the channel, you can subscribe to my newsletter at www.logicalwar.com. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.